I was standing at the bottom of a concrete stairwell, listening to a man swear he'd just seen the killer coming down those steps. I believed him, until I tried the door myself. It was locked tight, bolted from the inside, no broken latch, no spare key, no way in or out, and yet someone had been there. It was November 1984, the kind of November that feels more like a drowning than a season. I was working out of the 4th Precinct then, a place that smelled permanently of stale coffee and wet wool. The rain had been hammering the city for 3 days straight, turning the streets into black mirrors that reflected nothing but neon signs and bad decisions. I was sitting at my desk, watching a bead of water trace a path down the window pane, when the phone rang. It was a heavy, mechanical sound that seemed too loud for the empty office. I picked it up expecting a domestic dispute or a noise complaint. Instead, I got dispatch telling me there was a body at the St. Jude Apartments on Erning Street. The St. Jude was a relic, a crumbling brick pile from the 20s that had lost its dignity decades ago. When I arrived, the rain was coming down in sheets, rattling against the roof of my unmarked sedan. The blue lights of a patrol car were already flashing, cutting through the fog like a knife, illuminating the falling water in rhythmic, silent bursts. I stepped out, pulled my collar up, and felt the damp chill settle into my bones immediately. I met Officer Miller in the lobby. He was a young kid, green as summer grass, looking pale under the flickering yellow bulb of the entryway. He pointed up the stairs without saying a word. The crime scene was on the 4th floor. Apartment 4B. The door was open, and the hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and something sharper, copper. Inside, I found the victim, Eleanor Vance, 60 years old, a widow who lived quietly. She was slumped in her armchair, facing the window. No blood, just the terrible, unnatural angle of her neck and the bruising that was already darkening on her throat. The room was tidy. Too tidy. A cup of tea sat on the side table, still steaming slightly, a thin wisp of vapor rising into the cold air. Stay with me until the end. The truth behind this case still unsettles me. Standing in the corner of the room was the witness. His name was Arthur Penn. He was a thin man with nervous hands, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from that specific frequency of fear you can't fake. He was clutching an unlit cigarette so hard it had snapped in the middle. "I saw him," Penn whispered, his voice cracking. "I live across the hall. I heard a thump. I looked out my peephole. I saw a man in a heavy gray coat come out of Eleanor's apartment." I walked over to the window, peering out at the fire escape. Rusted. Useless. "And where did he go, Mr. Penn?" "The service stairs," Penn said, pointing to a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. "He didn't take the elevator. He went for the service stairs. I saw the door close behind him." I looked at the tea again. It was Earl Grey. The bag was still in the cup. This happened fast. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. I motioned for Miller to stay with the body and took Penn with me into the hallway. The corridor was silent, the carpet threadbare and smelling of dust. We walked to the end of the hall. The service stairwell door was a heavy fire door, painted a thick, institutional beige. I pulled it open. The hinges screamed, a sound of metal grinding on metal that echoed down the shaft. The stairwell was concrete, cold, and dimly lit by a single bulb hanging 3 floors down. It was a vertical tunnel of silence. "He went down?" I asked. "Yes." Penn nodded rapidly. I watched the floor indicator on the elevator. It didn't move. He had to go down. I listened. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the distant hum of the building's boiler. "Stay here," I told Penn. I began to descend. My shoes made soft, scuffing sounds on the concrete. I moved slowly, one hand on the railing, the other resting near my holster. The air in the stairwell was different, stagnant, colder than the hallway. I reached the third-floor landing, empty. The door to the third floor was shut. I continued to the second. Nothing but a discarded candy wrapper in the corner. First floor. The door leading to the lobby was welded shut. I knew that from previous calls to this building. The management had sealed it years ago to control entry. That left the basement. I went all the way down. The air here was heavy with the smell of wet earth and old iron. I reached the bottom landing. There was only one door, a steel door leading to the rear alleyway. If the killer had come down these stairs, this was the only way out. I approached the door. I expected it to be slightly ajar, or perhaps the lock broken. It was closed. I reached for the handle. It didn't turn. I shone my flashlight at the bolt. This is where the cold really hit me. The door was secured with a heavy-duty slide bolt, a thick bar of steel, rusted and covered in layers of old paint, and it was slid firmly into the locked position. What would you have done in my place? Assumed the witness was hallucinating? That's what I wanted to think. But here's the problem. I was standing on the inside of the door. The bolt was on my side. If the killer had come down the stairs and left through this door, he would have had to slide the bolt back, open the door, step out into the alley, and then, what? Rebolt it from the outside? Impossible. The mechanism was only accessible from where I was standing. I checked the hinges. Solid. I checked the frame. No tampering. I turned back to the stairs. The concrete shaft stretched up above me, silent and empty. "Miller!" I shouted up the shaft. My voice boomed, distorting in the narrow space. "Yeah, detective." Miller's voice drifted down, thin and tinny. "Check the roof access." "It's padlocked, sir. I checked it when we came in. The manager has the only key, and he's not even here." I stood there in the basement darkness, the flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. Let's review. The witness sees a man enter the top of the stairwell. I enter the stairwell minutes later. The roof is locked from the outside. The lobby exit is welded shut. The basement exit is bolted from the inside. And the stairwell is empty. I shined my light on the floor. The concrete was dusty, gray, and undisturbed. Wait. I crouched down. Near the bottom step, just at the edge of the light, there was a mark. It wasn't a footprint. It was a drop of water. I touched it. Cold, fresh. Then another drop, a few inches away. I followed the trail with my light. It didn't lead to the door. It didn't lead back up the stairs. The trail of water droplets led directly to the solid concrete wall under the staircase structure itself, a small triangular alcove where they kept buckets and mops. I drew my gun. The alcove was dark. The shadows seemed to pool there, thick and impenetrable. "Police," I announced. "Come out." Silence. I stepped forward, kicking a plastic bucket aside. It clattered loudly, the noise harsh and violent in the small space. I swept the light into the corner. Empty. Just a damp mop head resting in a gray bucket, smelling of bleach. I holstered my weapon and rubbed my face. I was missing something. Something obvious. I walked back up the stairs, my knees protesting the climb. When I got back to the fourth floor, Penn was still standing there, looking terrified. "He didn't come out, Mr. Penn," I said quietly. "He had to." Penn insisted, his eyes wide. "I didn't take my eyes off this door until you walked through it." "There's no one in the stairwell," I said, "and the exits are sealed." Penn looked at me, and then he said something that changed the temperature of the room. "But, Detective," he whispered, pointing at my coat, "you're wet." I looked down. The shoulders of my trench coat were soaked from the rain outside. "So was he," Penn said. "The man I saw. He wasn't just wearing a gray coat. He was dripping wet, like he'd just come in from the storm." I stared at him. If the man had just come in from the storm, he would have been wet. The drops on the basement floor were water, but how did he get into the 4th floor without passing the doorman or the lobby? And how did he vanish from a sealed stairwell? I walked back into the victim's apartment. Mrs. Vance was still sitting there. The tea was no longer steaming. I looked at the window again. 4th floor. She was facing it. I walked over and unlatched the window. It slid up smoothly, too smoothly. The tracks were greased. I leaned out into the rain. The fire escape was 5 feet to the left, too far to jump for an old woman, but easy for an athletic man. But the fire escape was rusted and alarmed. If anyone stepped on it, a bell would ring in the lobby. I knew this building. I pulled my head back in. And then I saw it. On the sill, on the outside of the glass, there was a smudge. Not a handprint, not a smudge of dirt. It was a smudge of gray paint. Wet paint. I touched the window frame. The paint was old and peeling. This smudge didn't come from the window. I looked at the floor rug. It was thick, Persian, dark red. It absorbed sound and moisture. I knelt down. I pressed my hand into the rug near the window. It came away damp. Someone had come in through the window, but that was impossible. There was no ledge, no balcony, just a sheer brick drop, 4 stories down to the concrete alley. My head was starting to throb. I needed a cigarette, but I didn't smoke on crime scenes. Not anymore. I stood up and looked at Miller. "Get the layout of this building," I said. "Blueprints. Tonight." "Detective," Miller said, looking at the door. "Mr. Penn is leaving." I turned. Penn was walking toward the elevator. "Mr. Penn," I called out. He stopped. He didn't turn around. "I'm going to bed, Detective," he said, his voice flat now. "I told you what I saw. If you can't find him, that's your problem." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. As the doors closed, I saw his face. The fear was gone. He looked relieved. I turned back to the empty stairwell door. The paradox was itching at the back of my brain. A wet killer, a sealed stairwell, a window that couldn't be reached. I had assumed the killer went down the stairs to escape. But what if he didn't? I walked back to the stairwell, opened the door, and looked up. Above the 4th floor, the stairs went up 1 more flight to the roof access. Miller said it was padlocked. I started to climb up. I climbed the final flight of stairs to the roof access door. My knees clicked with every step, a reminder that I wasn't 20 anymore, and that the damp cold of this building was seeping into my joints. The stairwell here was even quieter than below, the air stale and thick, smelling of dead pigeons and tar. The door to the roof was metal, heavy, and covered in a layer of grime that looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. I shone my flashlight on the padlock. It was a master lock, the old laminated kind. It was rusted shut. I gave it a tug. It held fast. I wiped my gloved finger across the hasp. The dust was thick and unbroken. No one had opened this door tonight. No one had opened it in years. So the killer didn't go down. The basement door was bolted from the inside. He didn't go up. The roof was sealed tight, and he wasn't on the landings in between. I stood there in the silence, listening to the rain drumming on the roof on the other side of that steel door. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something I rarely admit to. Doubt. Had I missed a hidden door? Was I losing my edge? Stay with me until the end, because the mistake I was about to make is the kind that haunts a detective when the lights go out. I went back down to the 4th floor. Miller was waiting in the hallway, looking anxious. The paramedics had arrived and were wheeling Eleanor Vance's body out. The gurney rattled over the uneven floorboards, a jarring, disrespectful sound in the quiet building. "Miller," I said, keeping my voice low. "Where did Mr. Penn go?" "He took the elevator, Detective. Like you saw. I assume he went to his apartment across the hall. Or maybe he went out for a walk to clear his head. He seemed pretty shaken." I looked at the door of apartment 4A. Arthur Penn's door. It was directly across from the victim's. "Get the building superintendent on the line," I ordered. "I want to know exactly who Arthur Penn is, and tell dispatch to run his name." Miller nodded and hurried toward the elevator to get a better radio signal. I stood alone in the hallway. I stared at the service stairwell door again. The paradox was gnawing at me. If the stairs were a dead end, then the witness was wrong. But why would he lie about seeing a man in a gray coat? And why did he point out the water on my own coat? That detail was too specific, too observant for a panicked old man. Before I tell you what I found inside 4A, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. I walked over to apartment 4A and knocked. "Mr. Penn?" "Just a few more questions." Silence. I knocked harder. The wood felt solid, but the frame was loose. This building was rotting from the inside out. I put my ear to the door. Nothing. Not even the sound of a TV or footsteps. I tried the handle. Locked. Now, a good detective waits for a warrant. A smart detective waits for backup. But a detective who feels the hair on the back of his neck standing up, he improvises. I pulled a tension wrench and a rake pick from my pocket. It took me 6 seconds. The lock tumbled with a soft click. I pushed the door open, my hand resting on my revolver. Police coming in. The apartment was dark, lit only by the neon glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The air smelled different here, not like an old man's apartment. It didn't smell of medicine or old paper. It smelled of bleach and cigarette smoke. Fresh smoke. I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. Bulb unscrewed. I used my flashlight. The beams swept across the room. It was sparse. A folding table, a sleeping bag on the floor, a suitcase in the corner. This wasn't a home. This was a lookout post. I walked to the window. A high-powered telescope stood on a tripod pointed directly across the street, not at the victim's apartment, but at the bank building opposite. Wait. I swung the telescope around. It could be aimed at Eleanor's window, but it had been moved. On the folding table, I found a half-empty pack of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and a notepad. I shone the light on the notepad. It was blank. I grabbed a pencil from the table and did the old trick, rubbing the lead sideways over the top sheet to reveal the indentations from the previous page. Words started to appear. 10 p.m. Target active. 10:15 p.m. Lights out. 10:30 p.m. Package secured. My stomach turned over. Package secured. I heard footsteps running down the hall. It was Miller. "Detective!" he shouted, forgetting all protocol. Dispatch came back with the info on Arthur Penn. I stepped out of the apartment, closing the door behind me. Let me guess. He has a record? Miller looked pale. No, sir. Arthur Penn died in 1979. Heart attack. This apartment has been listed as vacant for 5 years. The man I had spoken to, the nervous man in the cardigan, the man who directed my attention to the stairs, wasn't Arthur Penn. What would you have done in my place? Chased a ghost? Or realized you'd just been looking the killer in the eye? I ran to the elevator and smashed the button. Nothing. It was stuck on the lobby floor. I turned and sprinted for the stairs. The same stairs the killer supposedly used. I threw the door open and flew down the concrete steps, taking them 2 at a time, ignoring the pain in my knees. I hit the lobby door, the one that was welded shut. I forgot. I cursed and ran back up to the 2nd floor, cut through the hallway, and took the fire stairs down to the street. I burst out into the rain. The street was empty. The neon sign of a liquor store buzzed angrily nearby. "Miller," I yelled. "The car! What kind of car did he have?" Miller came running out behind me. "I didn't see a car, detective. He just got in the elevator." I stood in the pouring rain, water running down the brim of my hat, mixing with the sweat on my face. I had been played. The man in the hallway wasn't a witness. He was the cleaner, or the distractor. He had stood there, calm as you like, pretending to be a terrified neighbor, spinning me a story about a man in a gray coat and a locked stairwell to keep me occupied. He sent me into the stairs to look for a phantom while he walked right out the front door. But why the stairwell? Why create a puzzle that was impossible to solve? Why not just say he ran down the street? Unless the stairwell wasn't empty. My mind raced back to the basement. The water drops, the mop bucket, the triangular alcove under the stairs. I had shone my light there. I saw a bucket and a mop, but I hadn't moved the bucket. A cold realization washed over me, colder than the rain. I turned back to the building. "Miller, stay here. Watch the entrance." "Where are you going, Jack?" Miller asked, dropping the rank. "Back to the basement." I re-entered the building. The lobby was silent. The doorman's desk was empty. He was probably on a break or asleep. That's how the witness got in. I walked to the service stairwell door in the lobby. Welded shut. Right. I took the elevator down to the basement. The doors opened. The smell of wet earth hit me again. I walked to the bottom of the stairs. The steel door to the alley was still bolted from the inside. I walked over to the alcove under the stairs. The shadows were deep. I kicked the plastic bucket aside again. It clattered. I looked at the floor where the bucket had been. There was a square cut into the concrete. A drain? No. A hatch. It was small, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. Painted gray to match the floor. You'd never see it unless you moved the bucket. I holstered my gun and crouched down. I hooked my fingers into the recessed handle and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted. Below was a dark hole. The sound of rushing water echoed up. A storm drain. The city's old sewer runoff. I shone my light down. There was a metal ladder rung set into the wall of the shaft. And on the rung, a scrap of gray fabric. This was it. The man in the gray coat, if he existed, didn't go out the door. He went under the building. But here's the thing that stopped me cold. The witness upstairs had told me the killer went down the stairs. He wanted me to find this. He wanted me to find the hatch. Why? If he was the accomplice, why lead the police to the escape route? Unless, after this, there was no turning back for me. I stood up. I let the hatch slam shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. I wasn't the hunter. I was the hound being led by a scent. I heard a noise behind me. A soft metallic click. I spun around, hand on my revolver. The elevator doors were closing. I hadn't pressed the button. I ran to the doors, jamming my fingers into the rubber seal, trying to pry them apart. But the motor whirred and the car began to ascend. Someone had been in the basement with me. Watching from the shadows of the boiler room, I ran to the boiler room door. Locked. I was alone in the basement. The elevator was going up. I looked at the floor indicator above the elevator doors. 1, 2, 3, 4. It stopped at the 4th floor. The crime scene. I ran for the stairs. The same stairs I had cursed earlier. I bolted the door from the inside. "No," the witness said. "Wait." I was confusing myself. The basement door to the alley was bolted. The door to the stairs was open. I ran up the stairs. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor. I burst onto the 4th floor landing. The hallway was empty. Miller was gone. "Miller," I called out. Silence. I drew my gun. I moved down the hallway toward apartment 4B. The door was still open. I stepped inside. The body was gone. The paramedics had taken it. The room was empty. But on the small table where the tea had been, there was something new, a cassette tape, a standard TDK audio cassette sitting upright next to the empty teacup, and next to it a note written on the same notepad paper I'd seen in the fake witness's apartment. The note said, the 3 words, "Play me, Jack." How did they know my name? I hadn't introduced myself to the witness. Miller had only called me Detective. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I reached out and picked up the tape. It felt heavy in my hand like a loaded weapon. I looked around the empty apartment. The rain lashed against the window with the gray smudge. I had stumbled into something much larger than a murder. This was a message, and I was the intended recipient. I stared at the cassette tape. It was plastic, black and innocent looking, but it sat on that lace doily like a live grenade. The room was silent except for the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. The air felt pressurized, as if the walls of apartment 4B were slowly closing in. I needed a player. I found an old boombox in the bedroom, resting on a dusty dresser next to a row of porcelain dolls that seemed to watch me with dead, painted eyes. I carried it into the living room, plugged it in, and inserted the tape. I pressed play. There was a hiss of static, loud and sharp. Then a voice cut through. It wasn't the trembling, high-pitched voice of the witness, Arthur Penn. It was deeper, smoother, controlled. "Hello, Jack. You look tired. The stairs are hard on the knees, aren't they?" I froze. My hand hovered over the stop button. "Don't turn it off. We have business. You checked the basement door. Good. You found the hatch. Better. But you're asking the wrong question. You're asking how I got out. You should be asking why I let you in." The tape clicked off. That was it. 30 seconds of taunting. Stay with me until the end, because the voice on that tape dug up a grave I thought I'd filled 10 years ago. He knew my name, he knew my medical issues, and he knew my investigative process. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. This was personal. I ejected the tape and shoved it into my pocket. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Miller," I shouted again, moving into the hallway. The silence that answered me was heavy. I ran to the elevator. It was still on the 4th floor. The doors were closed. I pried them open with my shoulder, straining against the mechanism. The car was empty, but on the floor of the elevator cab, there was a police cap. Miller's cap. I knelt down. The inside of the rim was wet. Sweat? No, it smelled of chloroform, a sweet, chemical, sickly scent that cut through the old metal smell of the shaft. Miller had been taken. Before I tell you what I found in the shaft, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. I looked at the panel. The emergency stop switch had been pulled, then reset. Someone had stopped the elevator between floors, dealt with Miller, and then sent the empty car back up to taunt me. I pulled my radio. Dispatch. This is Harlan. Officer down. I repeat. Officer down at St. Jude Apartments. Suspect is armed and dangerous. I need a perimeter now. The static crackled. Copy, detective. Units are 10 minutes out. Weather is delaying response. 10 minutes. In a building this size, 10 minutes was a lifetime. I was alone. I went back to the stairwell. The locked stairwell. The paradox was still spinning in my head. Why did he want me to find the hatch? The tape said, "You're asking how I got out. You should be asking why I let you in." I walked back into the victim's apartment. I needed to think like him. He was watching. Where? I looked at the window again. The smudge of gray paint on the outside. I opened the window, letting the wind and rain blast into the room. I shined my light on the paint smudge. It was thick, industrial grade, and then I saw it. A thin, almost invisible fishing line was tied to the radiator, running out the window and down the side of the building. I hadn't seen it before because of the rain. I tugged on it. It was tight. I leaned out, tracing the line down. It didn't go to the ground. It went sideways, swinging in the wind, anchoring to the fire escape of the building next door. A zip line? No. It was a guideline. Something had been sent across the gap. The package. I whispered. The note in the fake apartment. Package secured. He didn't take the package out the door. He sent it out the window, across the alley to an accomplice waiting in the other building. The wet killer in the stairwell was just a distraction to keep me busy while the transfer happened. But what was the package? Eleanor Vance didn't have money. She didn't have jewelry. I turned back to the room. I ripped the cushions off the sofa. I pulled the drawers out of the dresser. In the bottom drawer of the bedroom bureau, under a stack of moth-eaten wool sweaters, I found a photo album. Leather-bound. Old. I flipped it open. Black and white photos from the 50s. A wedding. Eleanor, young and smiling. And her husband. I recognized him. It was Frank the Ledger Vance, a mob accountant who vanished in 1964. The rumor was he had turned state's evidence and was killed before he could testify. His body was never found. Eleanor wasn't just a widow. She was the keeper of the secrets Frank left behind. What would you have done in my place? Called for backup and waited, or followed the line? I realized then that the witness, the man who called himself Arthur Penn, wasn't just a hitman. He was a cleaner. He came for Frank Vance's ledger. And Miller was just in the way. I ran out of the apartment, past the elevator, and kicked open the door to the service stairs again. I ran up this time, toward the roof. The padlock on the roof door had been rusted shut, right? I had checked it. I reached the top landing. I grabbed the padlock. It crumbled in my hand. It wasn't rusted steel. It was wax, painted to look like rust. A prop. The witness had prepped this whole building. Every door, every lock, every distraction was a set piece in a play he was directing. I kicked the door open. The roof was a flat expanse of black tar, slick with rain. The wind up here was ferocious, whipping my trench coat around my legs like a captured flag. Across the roof, near the edge, overlooking the alley, I saw a silhouette. He was wearing a gray coat. He was standing perfectly still, looking out at the city skyline, oblivious to the storm. "Police!" I screamed, leveling my revolver. "Hands where I can see them!" The figure didn't turn. I advanced, step by slow step. The rain stung my eyes. "Turn around! Now!" The figure slowly rotated. It wasn't the man from the hallway. It wasn't the witness. It was Miller. He was standing precariously on the ledge of the roof, swaying. His eyes were wide, dilated, unseeing. His mouth was duct-taped shut, and strapped to his chest was a vest. Not a bomb vest. A tangled mess of wires and a cassette player, identical to the one in the apartment. The red light was blinking. Recording. I lowered my gun slightly. "Miller?" He muffled a sound, panic in his eyes. He tilted his head down. I looked at his feet. He was standing on a pressure plate. A crude homemade switch made of two metal sheets separated by a spring. If he stepped off... "Don't move, Miller," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. I scanned the roof. Where was he? Then I heard it. The voice. It wasn't coming from Miller. It was coming from the cassette player strapped to him. It was playing a loop, loud enough for me to hear. "Jack. Jack. Jack. Do you remember the docks? 1974. The blood drained from my face. 1. The Gold Coast case. The only case I ever walked away from. The only case where I let a suspect go because I wasn't sure. I looked around the dark roof. Shadows danced near the chimneys. "Show yourself," I yelled at the darkness. A match flared in the shadow of the water tower 30 feet away. The flame illuminated a face. It was the witness. The nervous, trembling old man was gone. In his place was a man with cold, dead eyes and a steady hand lighting a cigarette. He tossed the match into a puddle. It hissed and died. "You're not Arthur Penn," I said. "And you're not as sharp as you used to be, Harlan," he replied. His voice carried effortlessly over the wind. "You spent 20 minutes staring at a locked door downstairs while I was setting up the finale up here. Where is the ledger?" I demanded. "Gone," he said. "Sent across the wire 10 minutes ago. My partner is already halfway to the interstate." "Then why are you still here?" He smiled. It was a terrifying, mirthless expression. "Because I was paid extra to handle a loose end from 74. You see, Jack, Frank Vance didn't just keep records on the mob. He kept records on the police force. Dirty cops, payoffs." He took a drag of his cigarette. "And your name is in the book, Detective." The world stopped. My name? In a mob accountant's ledger? "That's a lie," I said. "I never took a dime." "Doesn't matter if it's true," he said softly. "It matters that it's written down. And now I have the book. I own your reputation. I own your legacy." He stepped back toward the fire escape ladder on the far side of the roof. "You have a choice, Jack. You can chase me. I'm tired. I might be slow. You might catch me." He pointed at Miller, who was trembling on the ledge, the pressure plate clicking under his shifting weight. "Or you can save the rookie. That switch under his foot is wired to a magnesium flare pack. If he steps off, it ignites. At this range, it'll blind him permanently and burn through that uniform in seconds. He'll fall. After this, there was no turning back for me." The killer put his hand on the ladder railing. "The book or the boy, Jack? Who are you really?" He began to climb down. I looked at the killer disappearing into the dark. I looked at Miller, tears mixing with the rain on his face, his balance failing on the wet ledge. I had seconds to decide. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the options. A man who stops to weigh the value of a human life against a book of numbers has already lost his soul. I holstered my gun and lunged. Not at the killer. He was already a shadow slipping over the edge of the roof. I lunged at Miller. I hit him waist high, tackling him backward, away from the ledge and onto the wet tar paper of the roof. My shoulder slammed into his chest, driving the air out of him. At the exact moment his weight left the pressure plate, there was a sound like a cracking whip. F-Z-Z-It. The magnesium flare ignited. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sudden, blinding birth of a miniature sun. The light was, absolute. It turned the rainy night into a bleached white void. Even with my eyes squeezed shut, the brilliance burned through my eyelids, painting my vision with angry red veins. The heat was instantaneous, a physical blow that singed the hair on my arms and smelled of ozone and melting plastic. Stay with me until the end, because the killer made one mistake, and it wasn't on the roof. We rolled across the gravel, coughing. The flare hissed and sputtered behind us, casting wild, jerky shadows against the brick chimneys. "Miller!" I shouted, my voice raw. "You okay?" Miller was gasping, clawing at the duct tape on his mouth. I ripped it off, gently as I could, but his skin was raw. I can't see, Jack," he stammered, panic rising. "I can't see." "It's flash blindness," I said, gripping his shoulder hard to ground him. "It'll pass. Stay here. Don't move." I stood up, blinking away the purple spots dancing in my vision. I ran to the edge of the roof, shielding my eyes from the dying flare. I looked down the fire escape, empty. The alley below was a river of black water and shadows. The killer was gone. He had vanished into the labyrinth of the city, just as he said he would. I slammed my hand against the wet brick. I had lost him. I had lost the ledger. I had lost the leverage. But my mind was still working. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind that cold, crystal-clear logic that only comes when the danger is past. I replayed the killer's words. "The ledger is gone. Sent across the wire 10 minutes ago." I looked at the fishing line again. It was still there, vibrating in the wind. I pulled out my pocket knife and cut it. The line went slack. I reeled it in. It was light, too light. If he had slid a heavy leather-bound ledger down this line, the friction would have burned the nylon, or the weight would have made it sag dangerously low. I ran my gloved finger along the line, smooth. No burns, no abrasions. Nothing had ever been sent down this line. It was a prop, just like the rusted padlock on the roof door, just like the water on the basement stairs. He lied. Before I tell you where the ledger really was, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. "Miller," I said, helping the kid to his feet. "Can you walk?" Yeah, vision is coming back. It's blurry, but I can see your shape." "Get downstairs. Call dispatch. Tell them the suspect is gone, but we have the scene secure. And get a paramedic to look at your eyes." "Where are you going, Jack?" "To get the mail," I said. I didn't wait for him to ask what I meant. I headed for the stairs. The logic of the crime was finally clicking into place, tumbling like the pins of a lock. Let's look at the timeline again. 1. The killer murders Eleanor Vance. 2. He sets up the witness nest in apartment 4A. 3. He calls the police. 4. He acts as the terrified witness, Arthur Penn. 5. He tells me the killer went down the service stairs. 6. I go into the stairs. I find the door locked from the inside. Why did he need the door locked from the inside? To create the mystery, to keep me occupied. But how did he lock it? He didn't do it tonight. He did it days ago, maybe a week ago. He entered through the sewer hatch, the one he wanted me to find, and bolted the door from the inside. Then he left through the sewer. He prepped the locked room puzzle in advance so that when the night came, he could trap the police in a loop of impossible logic. The wet killer he described? That was him. He walked into the building from the rain, killed Eleanor, and then dried off in 4A before I arrived. But the ledger, he couldn't carry it out. He left apartment 4A while I was in the stairwell. I saw him get on the elevator. He was wearing a cardigan, no bag, no suitcase. His hands were empty. If he didn't send it on the wire and he didn't carry it out, it was still in the building. But he said, package secured. And then I remembered the hallway on the 4th floor, specifically the brass fixture next to the elevator. The St. Jude was built in the 1920s. Back then, they installed gravity-fed mail chutes, a glass and brass tube running from the top floor all the way down to a collection box in the lobby. I ran down the stairs, skipping landings, sliding my hand down the banister. 4th floor. I stopped. I looked at the mail chute next to the elevator. Through the thick glass, I could see the empty shaft. I continued down. 3rd floor. 2nd floor. Lobby. The lobby was empty. The doorman was still missing. Paid off. Or frightened off, it didn't matter. I walked over to the main collection box. It was a heavy bronze box set into the wall, locked with a federal postal lock. I didn't have a key, but I had a crowbar in the trunk of my car. I ran out into the rain, popped the trunk, grabbed the tire iron, and ran back in. What would you have done in my place? Waited for a warrant to open a mailbox? Not tonight. I jammed the iron into the seam of the box. I wasn't being subtle anymore. I leaned my entire weight into it. The bronze groaned. The lock popped with a sharp crack. The door swung open. Inside, there was a pile of standard letters, bills, postcards, and resting on top of them, a thick, black, leather-bound book. He had dropped it in the chute on the 4th floor just before he stepped back into his apartment to play the witness. It fell 4 stories in silence and landed here, safely locked in a federal box that the police wouldn't think to check until the morning mail pickup. By then, he would be halfway to Mexico. I picked up the book. It was heavy. The cover was cold. I opened it. The pages were filled with columns of handwritten numbers, dates, names, amounts, Frank Vance's handwriting, the dead accountant's insurance policy. I flipped through the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to know. The killer on the roof said my name was in here. He said I was compromised, that I took money in 1974. I found the section for 1974. March, April, May. I ran my finger down the list of names. Some were politicians, some were judges, some were cops I knew. Men who had retired with nice boats and summer homes. I reached the bottom of the page. My finger stopped. There was an entry for the Gold Coast case. And next to it, a blank space. There was no name, just a question mark. Refused payment. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 10 years. The killer lied. He didn't have dirt on me. He just knew the rumor. He knew I had worked the case, and he gambled that I was like everyone else in this city, that I had a price, or at least a guilty conscience. He used my own fear against me to make me hesitate on the roof. I closed the book. I had the evidence, I had the motive, and I had the method. The locked staircase wasn't magic. It was a magic trick, a prepared stage, but the show wasn't over yet. I looked at the return address on the envelopes in the bin. They were all from residents of the building, but the ledger, it didn't have an envelope. It was just the book. Wait. If he dropped it in the chute, he must have known I would find it eventually. He was too smart to leave it to chance. Unless... I opened the book again. I looked at the inside back cover. There was a sticky note attached to the leather. For Jack. He gave it to me. Why? Why kill a woman for a book, stage a massive distraction, threaten a cop, and then leave the prize behind? I heard sirens approaching outside. The cavalry was finally here. I looked at the note again. For Jack. You're the only one dumb enough to publish it. He wasn't a cleaner for the mob. He was a cleaner for the other side. He didn't want the book to disappear. He wanted it found. But he couldn't just mail it to the Times. They'd bury it. He needed a cop to find it at a murder scene. He needed it entered into evidence. He needed it to be impossible to ignore. He killed Eleanor Vance to create a headline loud enough to make the ledger public. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. I wasn't the hero. I was the delivery boy. I walked out to the front steps to meet the squad cars. I held the book tight against my chest. The killer was gone. But the storm he started was just beginning. The squad cars arrived in a blur of red and blue, painting the rain-slicked street in violent, strobing colors. I stood on the sidewalk, the heavy leather book pressed against my chest, watching the chaos unfold with a strange sense of detachment. Paramedics were attending to Miller. He was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a saline rinse flushing his eyes. He was blinking rapidly, tears streaming down his face. But he was alive. He gave me a thumbs up, but his hand was shaking. He looked older than he had an hour ago. We all did. I handed the ledger to Captain O'Malley. He was a good man, a tired man. He took the book, flipped it open, and I saw his face go slack. He saw the names. He saw the dates. He knew in that instant that the department as we knew it was over. "Where did you find this, Jack?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the crackle of radios. "In the mail," I said. "Priority delivery." I didn't tell him about the killer's note. I didn't tell him that we had been played. I let the department have their win. I let them think they had solved the cold case of the century. But as I watched them tape off the building, I looked up at the fourth-floor window. The light was still on in apartment 4B. The window was open, the curtains billowing like ghosts in the wind. The killer was gone. He had vanished into the arteries of the city, the subways, the steam tunnels, the endless flow of traffic. He was a ghost, not because he was supernatural, but because he was a professional. He had come here to do a job, and that job wasn't murder. Murder was just the tool. The job was exposure. Stay with me for just a moment longer, because the ending of this story isn't about what we found, but what we lost. The trial, or rather, the trials, lasted for 3 years. The Vance ledger became the biggest scandal in the city's history. Judges stepped down. Councilmen were indicted. 7 high-ranking police officers were stripped of their badges and marched into cells. I watched it all from the back of the courtroom, silent and stone-faced. I was hailed as a hero, the detective who wouldn't let go, the man who found the smoking gun that cleaned up the city. But I knew the truth. I wasn't the hero. I was the instrument. The killer had profiled me just as I would profile a suspect. He knew I was stubborn. He knew I was obsessive, and he knew that if he put a puzzle in front of me, a locked door, a wet coat, a paradox, I wouldn't stop until I took it apart. He used my integrity as a lockpick. I retired 6 months later. The precinct felt different. It was quieter, sure, cleaner, but every time I walked down the hallway, I felt the eyes of the young officers on me. Some looked with awe, others with fear. They didn't see Jack Harlan. They saw the man who burned the house down. Miller quit the force 2 weeks after the incident on the roof. His vision came back, but he said the flash had burned something else out of him. He couldn't sit in a patrol car at night anymore. He said the shadows moved too much. He moved upstate, opened a small engine repair shop. I visited him once. He seemed happy, but he never asked about the case. We drank coffee and talked about the weather, carefully avoiding the silence that sat between us. And Eleanor Vance? She was buried in a small plot in Queens next to an empty grave meant for her husband. The press called her a victim of a robbery gone wrong. They never knew she was the guardian of the city's secrets. She died because a ledger was more valuable than a life. That's the math of the underworld, and it's a calculus I never learned to accept. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is hammering against my own windows, I think about that stairwell. I think about the door bolted from the inside. I spent so much time trying to figure out how he got out that I missed the terrifying reality of how he got in. He didn't break down the door. He didn't pick the lock. He was already there, waiting in the dark, waiting for us to look the other way. The locked staircase wasn't a puzzle. It was a mirror. It showed us that the walls we build to keep the bad things out, the laws, the procedures, the bolted doors, are only as strong as the people standing behind them. And if those people are compromised, if the rot is on the inside, then the lock doesn't matter. The killer sent me a postcard a year later. It had no return address. The picture was a generic shot of a beach in Mexico. On the back, there were no words, just a drawing, a simple hand-drawn sketch of a key. I burned it in my ashtray. I watched the card curl and blacken, turning into ash, just like the magnesium flare on the roof. I still live in the city. I still walk these streets. But I don't look at the skyscrapers anymore. I look at the cracks in the sidewalk. I look at the storm drains. I look at the things people walk over and ignore, because I know that's where the truth lives. Not in the light, but in the plumbing. The case of the locked staircase is closed. The books are balanced. The bad guys went to jail and the witness got away. It's a perfect ending, on paper. But life isn't paper. It's concrete and rain and blood. And sometimes the only way to open a door is to realize it was never really locked at all. That's the burden of this badge, even after you take it off. You carry the weight of the keys long after the doors are gone. Thank you for listening. There are hundreds of files still collecting dust in my cabinet, stories the city tried to forget. If you want to be here when I open the next case, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss the evidence. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.